Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Genealogy.blog. And today we have a great guest, Kai White. Kai and I met through Facebook, like I think most of us meet these days. And he did a fantastic chart for me. And he also writes several books and does some research. So welcome, Kai. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
So my first question for you today is, I know your family goes way, way back. So how did you get started doing your research?
I have always felt a pull toward my ancestors. One of the things I did growing up is ask my mother's mother all she could remember about her parents and grandparents and that sort of stuff. And even at 12 years old, I wrote that stuff down. My other grandparent was my father's father. Both of my remaining two grandparents died before I was born, so I never got to see them. And I did the same thing with my grandfather. I would ask him about his wife, my dad's mom, how they met and that sort of thing. And I've always written that stuff down. And my grandfather took me to his older brother's house, and that older brother had their grandmother's family Bible, and her name was Mary Ellen Crockett. And in Texas, that means something when you've got Crockett blood in you.
I bet it does.
So I have always been fascinated with that. And I started recording that. And over the years, I've built a database of, little over 50, probably 55,000 medieval people.
Right, yeah, and interesting, I think, everybody I talk to who does this says the same thing. You're kind of almost drawn to it. There's something inherent in your being that makes you want to do that. I find it amazing that when I talk to people, they all say the same thing.
Oh, yes. I've got brothers that feel no pull at all. Whenever I start talking, I bore them to death because they say, Kai, you want to spend more time with your dead relatives than your living ones. And I tell them that I do, because my dead relatives don't complain if I don't call or come by, and they never get mad if I don't visit. So there you go.
And interesting about the Crockett, my two children are adopted. So when my daughter turned 18, she wanted to find her birth parents. And so we did that. And they're from, her birth dad is from South Carolina. I forget the exact town, but not too far from Columbia. And when I started looking back into her families, she's a Boone.
Oh, cool.
So I said to her, you're a direct descendant of Daniel Boone. And she said, who's that? So I had to explain it. The other interesting thing is that her birth mom, I got her back to the Bassano brothers, who were musicians for the court of Henry VIII.
Oh, wonderful.
So they they came from Italy to England as musicians. There was, I think it was 3 brothers. And she's also a Spencer.
Well, that's interesting. They were highly motivated to play well if they were playing for Henry VIII.
Yeah, that's what I said. But they stayed. Her grandparents stayed there, and he made a family there. And so, she's got an Italian grandmother going back a couple of generations, and then she's got an Italian grandfather going back to the 14th century or whatever, yeah. Which is really pretty cool. So a little spoiler alert, for the Italians listening, Kai, as you can guess, is not Italian. But he's done a lot of amazing research for me in helping me find my family back and connect a few links. So with that, Kai, could you explain to people who don't know what a gateway ancestor is?
Oh, certainly. I got an email just the other day from a man wanting to know who I considered a gateway ancestor. And the definition of a gateway is not mine. A gateway ancestor is someone who came to the New World before 1700. And this is the important second criteria, also connects to medieval nobility or royalty. And so they have to meet those two criteria. For example, Mayflower ancestors are really neat, but only one of them is a gateway ancestor because they were poor religious people and they don't go back to nobility. In very few cases, we know who a Mayflower passenger's grandfather is, but most people can't go beyond that. So that gateway has got to link. And if I can say, for example, my wife, in about 10 generations, there's 2,096 people in that generation. And in that generation, one of those 2,096 people is the Reverend Hot Wyatt. And he was the pastor or the vicar at the colony of Jamestown. And the neat thing about him is that he's a descendant of King Edward III of England. And his wife, who died before he came to England, so she's not a gateway, but his wife was also a descendant of King Edward III, but through a different son. King Edward had about 4 or 5 sons. And so out of all the people in that generation, she has one that has medieval ancestry. And we have been able to build a complete 6-generation pedigree on that one man. So that's what a gateway is, and that's why they're called gateways. Once you find that person, she opens up everything for you.
Yeah, well, that's what, I mean, I didn't know. My gateway ancestor is in Italy, as you know. Mm-hmm. And I stumbled upon my great-grandfather's card. Well, I didn't stumble upon it. We've had it for quite some time. And I was quite amazed to find what I found out. And I think that's the tough thing for Italians. Very, very difficult to find a link like that. I think I found maybe, out of all the people I've talked to and emailed and messaged and everything else, maybe 5 that could actually trace their ancestors back to some nobility. And you would think it would be easier over there, but it's not, because when people came over, they didn't tell the stories about that. And nobody asked.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co.
See, and it's the same thing in my family, in that I asked and I wrote that stuff down, and had I not done that, it would be lost. And unfortunately, a lot of people lose their history that way.
Right, yeah, and I've always been a history buff, and to what we were saying earlier, some people just don't get it. So I'd like to ask you, when I first contacted you and I sent you the Caracciolo family and who I thought my links were, you confirmed that for me. How did you go about doing that and finding that? I know you have this huge database.
Right. And not only do I have a huge database, but I have access to a lot of data that isn't commonly known. And so there's German references and other European references that I was able to find from your genealogy and tie into it. And then once I did that, of course, I added your information into my database, so I have it at my fingertips permanently. And, one of the things that fascinated me was finding that you descend from King Louis IX, who we know in this country as St. Louis. And, just finding all of those connections. For me, doing medieval genealogy, some people do crossword puzzles, some people do Sudoku. This is much more complex and it's much more rewarding. You've got something that is worth something if you have that leaning towards your ancestors like you and I do.
Yeah, so what advice would you give to someone, whether they're Italian like I am, or whether think they have ancestors or connections going back to the 1700s and maybe have a gateway ancestor? How would you guide them to try and find that out?
Well, I would spend a lot of time in a genealogy library. That's one. And I come from a long line of American ancestors. I'm a 13-generation American and an 8-generation Texan. And I have spent a lot of time in courthouses and searching old, dusty, musty record books. But whenever you find that, there's just really something that, you find a piece of paper that's 200 years old that has their actual signature on it. Something like that to me is it's thrilling. And so what I would encourage everybody to do is start with all the information that they know. You start with your own birthday, birthplace, and then you go to your parents and discover birth, marriage, and death, places, and dates. And then your 4 grandparents. And so each time you find that, whenever you find your 4 grandparents, suddenly your work is doubled because you have 8 great-grandparents. And then you have 16 great-great-grandparents. And so it's rewarding, but don't get discouraged because as you go further and further back, you'll find gaps. And the thing is to find the ones that you can take back and take them back as far as you can, and then come back and start with maybe that 3rd or 4th generation on someone else and take that back and see where it leads. And, that's what my wife and I have done with us. It took us 20 years of research to be able to cross the Atlantic Ocean and to get back to Great Britain, which is where Cindy and I both, our ancestors came from. I am mostly Scottish. She is mostly English, and she takes great pride in telling me that her ancestors always beat up on my ancestors.
That's too funny. Well, I was amazed to find out that I had English ancestors, and I lived in England for a couple of years, and it's hard to put in words, but when you go to a place like Westminster, it's amazing. And I lived in England for a while. I had gone several times to Westminster, but I never knew I had a connection.
Right.
Until my last trip when I went over with my son, and I said, these are my grandparents here, it's very, very amazing. And to your other point, I remember when I came across the signature of Count Giacomo on my second great-grandfather's birth record. It's amazing to see the signature of someone that you're related to that long ago. And my father's grandfather, who he's named after, his signature, not exact, but similar in the way he would sign to the way my father would sign his name. It's just incredible to see that.
Yes, it's funny the things that are inherited, and you mentioned you have adopted daughters. I also have two adopted daughters, but Cindy and I have two biological daughters as well. We have 4 girls, and we had 2 of our own, and then there were medical issues and my wife couldn't have any more, but we always felt like there was another couple of kids out there. So we wound up adopting 2, and it was very interesting seeing the nurture versus nature play itself out in my daughter.
Yes, it is. That's true. We actually we have a son and a daughter, but they are so vastly different, even though they grew up in the same household. And that's true with even siblings. I mean, biological siblings, it's true,
Oh, absolutely.
You inherit different things from different people. And I came across, I don't know if I ever shared this with you, but I'll have to do that. I'll have to send you. I came across a picture of my 9th great-grandfather, Prince Marino Caracciolo, the Golden Fleece guy, or one of them. And I looked at it and I said, I have a photograph of me, probably close to the same age as this guy. And we don't look exactly alike, but certain features, it's amazing. It's just incredible to see that. And I show it to other people, and because I don't take anything at face value, and they say, you do resemble him. It's funny. And when you live in England and you go to the manor houses and you see the Duke of Pimpernel from 1500, and you see the Duke of Pimpernel 16 generations later, they look alike.
Yes. In my own family, I can remember dating my wife, and I was probably 17 or 18. And I had told her that Davy Crockett, I'm not his grandson, I'm his nephew, back. I descend from Davy's older brother. But in Texas, there's statues of him. And we went to a house of wax, and there was a really good wax statue of Davy Crockett. And I looked around, and nobody was in this little part of the gallery except Cindy and I. And so I hopped over the velvet rope and put my arm around that statue. And I said, what do you think? Do I favor him? And she looked and she said, you do. You've got the same jaw and chin and the same mouth. And it's funny. Years later, my dad told me the story of his aunt was killed in a car wreck, and my grandfather identified his little sister, and the way he did it was by her jaw and her chin. And it's a very distinctive feature in my family. And based on that wax statue, it may be a Crockett inherited trait. So,
right, and that's true with my dad's mom. They have a very square jawline, and when I started connecting to some of the distant cousins in Italy, and they started sending me photographs, it's very prominent.
right.
They have that featured jawline, that very prominent kind of jawline. And my sister always tells me it's the Sorrentino jawline, and I said, no, it's not the Sorrentino family. It's the Piramalo family. It's grandma's family.
Right.
And she gets mad at me.
Oh, we do the same thing. People have said, well, this is the family trait. And I said, yes, but it came through the female line a couple of generations before. It's really not that particular family.
Yeah, that's funny. So I know you've written a lot of different books, especially the Crusaders, and like you mentioned, medieval. And I know you also do bespoke for families. So could you talk a little bit about your research there and what you could do for somebody if they do have a gateway ancestor and want to document their family back?
Oh, absolutely. I've written 3 or 4 general books, but what I do specifically for clients, if they have a gateway ancestor, I have a database that if I can connect you to medieval nobility, and it makes no difference if it's Italian, Spanish, Hungarian, or British, or Danish, if I can connect you to my database, I have the means that at the push of a button, I can tell it to generate a book, basically, but it's a pedigree of every known ancestor, and it goes from the present day. And I have people send me their family photos and their stories of their parents and grandparents that they want in there. And so they will send me as much information as they have until they get to that gateway ancestor. And then from there, I have it in my computer. And so I tell the computer to generate that book with everybody in it, and it has every ancestor that they have all the way back. And so my typical book is right at 1,600, 1,700 pages. And that's broken into 4 volumes because Amazon.com won't let me print more than 500 pages in a volume simply because of the binding. But the grand total of all the volumes is usually somewhere between 1,500 and 1,700 pages. It has somewhere between 4,000 and 7,000 footnotes. And my wife and I do a lot of charts that highlight specific things. And so it comes with about 100 of our specific charts to highlight, for example, the Lusignan Crusader family of France or something like that, because a picture's worth 1,000 words. And so I believe in those charts. But that's the typical book that I put together. And I say at the touch of a button, and that's true, but I push the button and I come back about 12 hours later. And that's how long it takes to generate that. And then it takes me about a month working almost full time to get it print ready, to make sure that everything is lined up within the margins and there's no blank pages or anything like that, to get it print ready. And then I submit it to Amazon and it goes through their editing process. And then I have a publishable book with an ISBN number. It's there forever. So if you order one copy and 15 years later, a nephew or something like that wants a copy of it, it's there. And that's the neat thing about that.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. That's great. And if somebody else wants to order it either now or later, or they have that readily available. And I haven't gotten there yet, but I really want to do that one day. But I did have you do my chart, and what I find fascinating, or the best part about your charts, is they aren't busy. They're very easy to follow, And for people listening or may want to look at it, I'm going to have the links out there where you could get a chart that Kai makes or the book. But it's very easy to follow the path back to the, from a gateway ancestor back to the nobility of Europe. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit, Kai, on how you create those charts and why you do it that way as opposed to the traditional, fan chart or something like that.
Right. We do it that way to put as many illustrious people on a chart as we can. And the other thing that we do that's significantly different from everyone else is sometimes you'll see a chart and you have lines crossing and that sort of thing. And after a while, it begins to look like a circuit wiring diagram. And so we don't do that. Our charts are full color. And if, for example, if you've got an ancestor that you descend from both, you've got an ancestor whose mother and father both have royal lines, like the man that I mentioned, Cindy's ancestor, the Reverend and his wife, both go back to King Edward III. But there's a lot of stuff that one of those, the wife has that the husband doesn't. And so we use color coding to show that person appears somewhere else on the chart. The other thing that we do that makes our charts, I think, really stand out and attractive is, besides the 50,000 person database, I have a database of about 3,000 coats of arms. And so we put those on the chart. And I've had people say, oh, well, you're like one of those kiosks in the mall. And we're not. We don't sit there and say, oh, because your last name is Sorrentino or White, everybody with that last name is entitled to that coat of arms. You're not. They're individual. But if you descend from an individual who had a coat of arms, we will put that coat of arms on the chart. And heraldry, those coats of arms, if you know how to read them, will tell a genealogy story all their own. And it's fascinating, at least to me.
Yeah, to me too. And I know a lot of people think that because they have that same last name that they're entitled to that. But, I know from my research that it really only belongs to one person. But it's nice to think that, you could have sat next to the prince one day or something like that.
Absolutely.
That's what I like about it. And, it does give you a little bit of bragging rights, I suppose. But yeah, I know the charts are really, really cool. So I want to ask you one thing because we've all been watching it now for several years, is the Vikings. I know I have a link back to Rollo. I think I may even have one back to Ragnar, who I'm not sure is really real, but I think Rollo is. Can you explain to people, Rollo, Ragnar, were they really brothers? Did all this stuff really happen the way it is? I know it didn't, but maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Absolutely. If you go back to English royalty, to William the Conqueror, his father's father's father, back about 6 or maybe it's 7 generations, is Rollo the Dane. And from Rollo, we can trace his lineage back about another 5 or 6 generations. I will say that the Viking Department of Vital Statistics was not up to current standard. So there's a lot of gaps in there. But Rollo and Ragnar were not brothers. And there is no document that mentions from the time of Ragnar about Ragnar. What is pretty well documented are Ragnar's sons, but there's not a piece of paper that says Bjorn Ironsides was his son, or Ivar the Boneless was his son, or Sigurd Snake in the Eye was his son. There's not. Contemporary. The sagas, they're called, were written about anywhere from 200 to 400 years after the time of Ivar the Boneless and Bjorn Ironsides. And so the Viking bards, storytellers, could recite the lineage and everything else, but it wasn't written down, like I said, from 200 to 400 years after they all lived. And so you can take that and accept it, or you can say, well, there's no document from that time that does it. So, the other thing in the Vikings is Ivar could not have children. He was impotent. That's not the case. There are documented sons of Ivar the Boneless, so they don't know if he had brittle bones or, why. They don't know why he got the name, but it wasn't because he was impotent. He fathered sons, and and I don't think he was very brittle boned either. You don't become king of northern England and Ireland if you can't fight, at least not that way.
Yeah, well, that's so when we watch it, we laugh about it, because I say if he was really the way they're portraying him, I don't think he would have been around and in these positions that he was, all these things that he was supposedly doing in the Viking saga as we watch it on TV.
Yes, and the other thing is Lagertha or Lagertha, the shield maiden.
Yes.
She's a story, but the birth order of the sons is not right. All of those sons that are in the Vikings were the children of Aslog, where Bjorn is the child of his first wife, and all the others, the children of his second wife. And historically, they don't know that Lagertha lived. All of the sons are children of Aslog, and Bjorn wasn't the oldest. So, they take a few, what do you call it? They take
they're taking liberties with the stories.
Exactly.
Yeah. I know when I watch some of these, especially when I started doing my research and I started watching the Borgias, I was sitting there with my wife and saying, that's my grandfather and that's my aunt and this one's this. And, again, they did the same thing because they had, they portrayed, I think it was Francesco Gonzaga's wife as like a lunatic, when actually his wife was Isabella d'Este, who was, I always say she was like the Jackie Kennedy of the 1400s.
Right.
And I said why did they do this? History is so fascinating in itself. Why do they feel the need to make up stuff to fit some kind of crazy story? I don't get it.
Exactly. I can remember having several conversations when the movie Braveheart came out, 15 years ago, because there were people that actually believed that William Wallace was the father of Edward III, that he slept with the French princess, and nothing could be further from the truth. William Wallace was put to death before King Edward II married the French princess. he was already king before that wedding took place. And so William Wallace died long before the French princess ever came to England. They never met, So that whole premise of the movie is wrong. And,
I know.
but it's a good movie.
No. Most of them are. But like I said, I always, it may be because I'm a history buff. Like even when I'm doing my own research, and even when I talk to you, or when I confirm some stuff with the people in Italy, I always err on the side of doubt. Like I'm not taking anything at face value. I have to know that these people are, really my people. Otherwise, what's the point? I'm only kidding myself,
Yeah. About the only thing that was accurate about Braveheart is he really did have a wife who was killed. And so it's very doubtful that he has any descendants today, but
Right.
but like I said, I thought the movie deserved, the Best Picture Oscar. So there you go.
So I'd like to ask you one more thing, and that's around Charlemagne, because there's a lot of myths around him, and people say, well, everybody's related to Charlemagne in some way, shape, or form, which I suppose is true. I mean, he's probably got millions and millions of descendants.
Right.
My argument with them is always, while that's true, if you could trace it, it's really cool. So can you explain about, Charlemagne? I've heard that there were male heirs, still there aren't, that the only heirs of Charlemagne today through the female lines.
And that is true. All of the males, they're called the Carolingian dynasty because Charles in Latin is Carol. And so Charlemagne was Carolus Magnus, which is Charles the Great in Latin. And about 6 generations from Charlemagne, the last male heir was blinded and castrated, and that ended the line.
That's a rough way to end the line.
Yes. And so, but they made sure, and it's the same thing with the Merovingian dynasty. The male line died out, and once the Merovingians died, then the Carolingians took over. And so it's been that way. The successors of the Carolingians were the Capets, the ruling house of France. And of course, with the French Revolution, they're not there now. Mm-hmm. But the king of Spain is a Bourbon. And the Bourbons were a younger house of the House of Capet. The king of Spain today, through the male line, can trace to Hugh the Great Capet, who, it's about 1,100 years.
Wow, that's amazing.
It is amazing.
Wow. I'm stunned that that male line lasted that long.
Yeah. And he has a son, so it's going to keep coming, And he's a direct, one of his male heirs was King Louis XIV, which everyone's heard of. Mm-hmm. So the King of Spain is a male line descendant of Louis XIV.
Wow, that's something. Well, Kai, this has been fascinating, as I knew it would be. I really, really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. Follow us on Facebook in the Italian Genealogy group or at www.italiangenealogy.blog. I was using another podcast host until I switched to Buzzsprout. I found that Buzzsprout offered much more for half the cost. For example, better access to get your podcast on directories such as Apple and Spotify, better tools to embed your podcast, and a free website. Check them out and receive a $20 Amazon gift card after signing up.